10 years ago, consultant and family counselor Kim John Payne wrote in his book, Simplicity Parenting, about a family that he was asked to help. James was about 8 years old and entering 3rd grade when I met his parents. Lovely and very bright people. James's mother was a professor and his father worked in city government. They were worried about their son having trouble sleeping at night and his complaints of stomach aches. Both parents spoke proudly about how confidently James could speak with adults, but acknowledged that he had trouble connecting with his peers. He avoided things that he felt might be dangerous and had only very recently learned to ride a bike. Whenever they drove someplace in the car, James would be the self-appointed backseat driver, like you've never heard before, letting them know when they're even 1 or 2 miles above the speed limit, scanning the road ahead for concerns of any kind. As I got to know the family, I noticed how much their daily lives were colored by world issues. Both parents were avid news followers. The TV was often on and tuned into CNN, whether they were focused on it or not. Politically and intellectually oriented, they would discuss issues at great length, particularly environmental concerns. From an early age, James had been listening to these conversations. His parents were proud of his knowledge. They felt that they were raising a little activist. How many of us are doing that? A citizen of the world. James's understanding of global warming seemed to rival Al Gore's. He was also becoming very anxious. His parents and I worked together on a simplification regime. We made some changes in the home environment and greatly increased the sense of rhythm and predictability in their daily life patterns. But our primary focus was on cutting back James's involvement in his parents' intellectual lives and his access to information. How much information was pouring into the house and into James's awareness? So instead of 3 computers, his parents decided to keep 1 in the den off the master bedroom. And after much discussion, they removed both televisions from the home. Game Boys and Xboxes were also removed, minimizing the number of screens throughout the house. I was most impressed, however, by the commitment they made to change some very ingrained habits. Quite bravely, they aimed to keep their discussion of politics, their jobs, and their concerns for a time after James went to bed. This was hard to do at first, but with practice, the change became second nature. The quality of their nightly talks intensified, and both parents came to really appreciate this time together because it was exclusively theirs. James's parents noticed changes in him within the first couple of weeks. His level of anxiety went down, and his sleep improved. He started coming up with ideas for projects and things to do that wouldn't have interested him earlier. It was spring, and the weather was outstanding. Was that it? His parents wondered. At first, they weren't sure, but the trend continued. James was definitely mucking about more, getting involved in building things, catching lizards, digging holes, of course. Within about 3 or 4 weeks' time, James's teacher also reported changes in him. As his play life expanded, his pickiness about food waned. As he started interacting with some of the kids in the neighborhood, particularly one with whom a lifelong friendship blossomed. There wasn't any one thing that obliterated James's nervousness and controlling behaviors, but the steps taken to protect James's childhood definitely had an effect on him and his parents, an effect greater than the sum of their parts. When you simplify a child's world, you prepare the way for positive change and growth. This is especially important now because we are building our daily lives and our families on the 4 pillars of too much. Too much stuff, too many choices, too much information, and too much speed. With this level of busyness, distractions, time pressure, and clutter, mental and physical, children are robbed of the time and the ease that they need to explore their worlds and their emerging selves. Even as our own inner voices are silenced by the urgencies and obligations of the 4 pillars of too much stuff, too many choices, too much information, and too much speed, our instincts as parents give us pause. We stop short now and then and wonder how this pace is affecting our children. We're confronted with the often simple requests of these small beings whom we love immeasurably, and yet their pleas seem to be coming from a galaxy far away from the planet Slow. The 2 or 3-year-old asking for the same story to be read again and again becomes an 8-year-old who wants to tell you the plot of a movie in such remarkable detail that the retelling will surely take longer than the movie itself. And you've figured out a complicated carpool schedule that requires split-second timing, but saves you a round trip or 2 per week. The whole enterprise grinds to a halt each morning, though, around 2 laces that will not be tied, or 1 head of hair that cannot be brushed, or 1 backpack that is always, but always missing something. The pace of our daily lives is increasingly misaligned with the pace of childhood. As a society, we've signed on wholeheartedly to the notion that more, bigger, newer, and faster all mean better. But childhood has its own mysterious processes, its own pace. When we ask children to keep up with a speeded-up world, I believe we are unconsciously doing them harm. By simplifying, we can protect the environment for childhood's slow, essential unfolding of self. Well, I have a sneaking suspicion that some of this advice could also apply well to adults. On an episode of Hidden Brain called The Value of Deep Work in the Age of Distraction, Georgetown computer science professor Cal Newport said, "We know we are not supposed to multitask if we want to be less distracted, but it is hard to resist. We act like a human network router, processing messages all day. When we just check our devices, we are switching context, and switching context, no matter how long, negatively impacts cognitive performance. There's a cost to the constant distractions that pervade our lives." I wonder why distraction is so attractive. Well, Newport says that with constant connectivity, we gain a sense of meaning and usefulness. We respond because we are wired to be social, and we can prove that we are valuable. Busyness looks like productivity. But for those who are privileged enough to have a job with a potential to do both shallow and deep work, Newport suggests you talk with your boss and decide what your ratio between deep and shallow work should be to optimize your position. Sophie Bates reported in the Stanford News last fall that after a decade of data, researchers at the Stanford Memory Lab found that multitaskers have reduced memory. They said there really isn't such a thing as multitasking because the human brain only allows us to focus on one thing at a time. So what we really do when we try to multitask is we switch tasks. Memory scientist Anthony Wagner found a relationship between media multitasking, or switch tasking, and memory and attention. Half of the studies showed that the heavy media multitaskers significantly underperform on tasks of working memory and sustained attention. It turns out that we are not dolphins who sleep with one half of their brain at a time while the other half of their brain does something else. Oh, that we could be, but we are not. New York Times columnist David Brooks wrote in his op-ed, "Evolution of Simplicity," "Many of us are on a wireless hamster wheel, running furiously to keep the inbox in the same place. Something special, like a dinner party or a museum visit, is hollowed out when your mind is on your screen or at 5 places at once. After a while, there's an ache in all that scattered shallowness. So, of course, there's a mass movement to combat mental harriedness, the epidemic of ADD. Of course, there's a struggle to regain control of your own attention, to set priorities about what you will think about, to see fewer things, but to see them more deeply." Brooks also offers a critique of simplicity movements that try to solve this contemporary problem. He wrote, "One of the troublesome things about today's simplicity movements is that they are often just alternate forms of consumption. Magazines like Real Simple are sometimes asking you to strip away your stuff so that you can buy new, simpler stuff." There's a whiff of the bourgeoisie ethos there, that simplification is not really spiritual or anti-materialist. It's just a more refined, organic, locally grown, and morally status-building form of materialism. Today's simplicity movements, he continues, are also not as philosophically explicit as earlier ones. The Puritans were stripping away the material for a closer contact with God. Thoreau was stripping away on behalf of a radical philosophy. It's easy to see what today's simplifiers are throwing away. It's not always clear what they are for. It's not always explicit what rightly directed life they envision. Today's simplifiers may instinctively be, however, seeking higher forms of pruning, being impeccable with your words, parsimonious but strong with your commitments, selective about your friendships, moving generally from fragmentation toward a unity of purpose. There's an enviable, emotional tranquility to be found at the end of that road. In 1995, Linda Breen Pierce became interested in the voluntary simplicity movement and wanted to hear from people who were choosing to simplify their lives. So she set up a survey on the internet, received 211 responses, and did in-depth interviews with 40 people. And one of the questions she asked was, what motivated people to seek a simpler life? For many, it was a life-altering event, such as illness, divorce, or loss of a job. These life-altering events cause people to stop and take stock of their lives and their journey turned inward to discover what was truly important for them. For others, it was a realization of their mortality. Steve Cullinan, a study participant, wrote, "My father died of a sudden heart attack at age 63, less than 1 year after retirement. It made me really analyze what was important to me, where I was expending my life energy, and to start to think about changes that I might make to live a happier and more fulfilling life. He continued, I think the realization of our mortality has had the greatest significance in the process of simplifying my life. We are given a very short time on this earth, and so many of us are on automatic pilot. Well, for others, it was environmental concerns and the desire to live more lightly on the earth that caused them to simplify. For others, it was a sense of inner emptiness. Jennifer Young, a 27-year-old study participant, said, I had a nagging feeling of dissatisfaction that wouldn't go away. I kept thinking, is this it? Is this what I waited to be a grown-up for? Too many hours at a job I no longer love, shallow relationships, and bills for things I should not have purchased in the first place. Others reported their motivation came from worry about money and from too much stress in a fast-paced life, or a desire to spend higher quality time with their families. What is simplicity? Merriam-Webster's definition is the state of being simple, uncomplicated, freedom from pretense or guile, directness of expression, and restraint in ornamentation. Henry David Thoreau, our Unitarian Transcendentalist ancestor, wrote, I do believe in simplicity. When a mathematician would solve a difficult problem, they first free the equation of all encumbrances and reduce it to its simplest terms. So, simplify the problem of life, he wrote. Distinguish the necessary and the real. Probe the earth to see where your main roots run. Leo Babauta said, simplicity boils down to 2 steps. Identify the essential, eliminate the rest. Saint-Exupéry said, you know you've achieved perfection in design, not when you have nothing more to add, but when you have nothing more you can take away. The irony in my mind is that getting to simplicity can be complicated. It does take practice. It takes practice to resist the wider culture's values of materialism, of status, and especially, I think, of over-commitment. It takes community to help to support our endeavors to simplify life. We really can't do it so well alone. Community can help us figure it out, whether we're letting go of possessions, activities, relationships, or ways of living that obscure what is really important. What is most important? And how do we practice living from that source when life is so complex? I think we need each other to figure that out. Unitarian Universalist minister Scott Taylor reminds us that simplicity is not a single-player game. No one can reject and confront a community of broken values without the promise and support of an alternative community, a community that celebrates a different equation of what makes worthy living. Perhaps that, my friends, is one of the biggest reasons we are here together.